I came here to survive. Now I'm bound to a creature who could burn the whole world. And worse, I think I want her to. If you're into survival stories where love sparks amidst ruins and fire, don't forget to like, subscribe, and join me on this journey. Jace Carter had never begged the stars for mercy. Mercy didn't exist in the galaxy's wars, where humanity clawed its way through blood and fire. But as his ship spiraled toward doom, he gripped the controls with a ferocity that defied fate. It wasn't a glitch that doomed him. It was an ambush. Ashari fighters, their obsidian hulls glinting like death itself, had torn through his convoy with surgical precision. He'd watched his wingman's ship erupt in a silent fireball, a fleeting scream swallowed by the void, before his own vessel took the hit. Alarms blared, screens flickered red, the hull groaning as it split open under relentless plasma barges. He fought to stabilize, veins bulging in his forearms, a soldier honed by Earth's endless battles. But the enemy's last shot sent him plummeting toward an uncharted world, a lone spark falling into the unknown. The crash was a cacophony of destruction. His ship slammed into the planet's surface, carving a jagged trench through crystal-laced soil, metal shrieking as it twisted and broke. The cockpit crumpled around him, sparks showering like dying embers, heat searing his skin as he wrestled free of the straps. Blood dripped from a gash above his eye, stinging as it mixed with sweat, but he clawed his way out, dragging himself from the wreckage with a grunt of pain. His breath came in sharp bursts, the air outside thick and shimmering, charged with an electric hum that pressed against his chest like a living pulse. He stumbled upright, boots sinking into soil that glittered like shattered glass, his plasma knife buzzing faintly at his hip, a flicker of defiance in a world that mocked his survival. The landscape was a sci-fi fever dream, alien and mesmerizing. Crystal spires rose like sentinels, their facets pulsing with violet light, rooted in a ground veined with glowing tendrils that snaked through the dirt. Vines coiled around their bases, faintly luminescent, weaving through ruins of a civilization lost to time. Arches and walls etched with symbols that danced in his vision, shifting as if alive. The air thrummed, a low vibration sinking into his bones, a rhythm that felt too intimate, too deliberate to be natural. His comms crackled with static, dead, his crew gone, either burned in the void or buried in the wreckage, he couldn't tell. The silence was a blade, cutting deeper than the ache in his ribs, but Jace didn't break. He'd lost too much to falter now. Worlds, comrades, pieces of himself. And he pressed forward, scanning the shadows, every rustle a threat, every glow a question. The hum grew louder, a whisper weaving through the spires, and he felt it. A pull, a presence that wasn't just the planet's strange life. She stepped from an archway of fractured crystal, and his world shifted. Her skin glowed a deep, molten red, bare and radiant, catching the violet light like a flame brought to life. White hair flowed over her shoulders, wild and bright as a comet's trail, framing a face with green eyes that locked onto his, sharp, ancient, alive with a curiosity that stopped his breath. She stood tall, her stance commanding the ground beneath her, her form familiar yet alien, sculpted with an elegance that seemed born of this world's pulsing harmony. Between her thighs, the lines of her body flowed smoothly, subtle and organic, a quiet testament to her kind's unity with their strange home. His pulse quickened, his soldier's calm faltering as he took her in, caught between awe and a strange pull he couldn't name. "Who are you?" he rasped, voice rough from smoke and strain, hand twitching toward his knife though it felt useless against her. "What kind of woman walks out of this chaos like she belongs here?" She tilted her head, her white hair shifting, her voice a warm thread cutting through the hum, soft, steady, but edged with something wild. "I am Lyra, keeper of this shattered place. You crashed in my world, Jace Carter, a warrior bleeding into my silence. Are you staring because you're lost, or because I'm something you've never seen?" Her words struck him, direct and unflinching, peeling back his defenses. He'd heard his name, how? Had she sensed it? pulled it from the wreckage of his mind. He swallowed, his throat dry as he struggled for words. I didn't mean to stare, he said, the denial shaky, his voice rougher than he intended. Where I come from, people don't look like you. It's throwing me off. Tell me, Lyra, are you trying to unsettle me, or is this just who you are? Her lips curved, a faint smile that held no shame, only a quiet knowing, her green eyes glinting with a warmth he couldn't escape. My kind doesn't hide, she said, stepping closer, her bare feet silent on the crystal dust, her presence washing over him like a tide. I am what I am, no armor, no lies. But you feel something, don't you? Right here. She pressed a hand to her chest, her gesture simple but deliberate, and his breath hitched, a strange warmth spreading through him. So, human, are you shaken because I'm different, or because something in me calls to you? He stepped back, instinct clashing with the pull she'd sparked, his boots scraping the ground as he fought to steady himself. I don't shake, he said, though his voice wavered, low and unsteady, his chest tight with an emotion he couldn't name. I've seen war, death, worlds torn apart. None of it hit me like you. You're too real, Lyra, too alive. What are you doing to me? Are you testing me, or showing me something I've forgotten? She closed the distance again, her warmth brushing the air between them, her red skin glowing brighter as the spires pulsed in rhythm. No test, she said, her voice dropping, threading through him like a quiet song. I'm a keeper, a survivor, like you. But I don't bury what I feel, what I've endured. Look at me, Jace. Does my presence trouble you? Or does it stir something you've kept hidden? The air thickened, the planet's hum rising, its violet light bathing her in a glow that felt like fate. He stood there, a man forged in battle, now facing a woman who wasn't just a mystery. She was a spark, lighting something he'd buried beneath years of war. His crew was gone, his ship a ruin, and yet here she was, reaching him with every word, every glance. I don't know what you are, he said, voice low, raw with truth, but I'm not turning away. So tell me, do you feel this connection too? Or am I alone in this? Her eyes softened, a flicker of something deeper breaking through her calm, her hand lifting to hover near his chest, close enough to make his skin prickle without touching. I feel it, she said, her voice a whisper that sank into him. A thread, Jace, a spark between us, tying us before we even knew. Are you ready to follow it, or will you let it fade before it grows? The spires pulsed louder, their light weaving a cage around them, and Jace felt it, a bond, a question he couldn't ignore. She was more than a woman, more than this world, and he was already caught, whether he admitted it or not. The violet light of the crystal spires pulsed around them, casting jagged shadows across Lyra's red skin as her question, Are you ready to follow it, or will you let it fade before it grows? Lingered in the air like a quiet challenge Jace couldn't turn away from. Her hand hovered near his chest, her fingers close enough to make his skin prickle with awareness, her green eyes locked on his with a steady intensity that reached past his defenses. The planet's hum thrummed through the ground, syncing with the rhythm of his pulse, a sound that felt alive, almost knowing. He stood there, a soldier forged in war, his plasma knife a cold weight at his hip, but it was her voice, her presence, that held him fast. His crew was gone, his ship a ruin, and yet this woman, this alien, had anchored him to a world he couldn't yet grasp. He stepped closer, narrowing the gap, his boots crunching on the crystal dust as he met her gaze. I don't fade, he said, voice low, rough with the effort of steadying himself. But you're stirring something I thought I'd lost. Was this, Lyra, some kind of alien bond, or just you being more real than I'm used to? Her smile widened, faint but knowing, her white hair shifting as she tilted her head, studying him with a quiet curiosity. No bond forced on you, she said, her voice a warm hum that settled in his chest, threading through him. I'm a keeper, a survivor, like you. My kind doesn't bury what we feel. You fell here, Jace, and I felt you. Your strength, your fire. Tell me, Does it unsettle you that I sense you? Or does it make you wonder what I see? He frowned, his hand flexing at his side, the air between them thickening with her words. You don't know me, he said, though the words rang hollow, his eyes drifting briefly over her form, radiant, unhidden, a presence he couldn't ignore, before snapping back to her face. I've lost everything, my ship, my men, and now you're here like you got answers. We see, Lyra. What's this thread you're talking about? Something in me, or something I can't look away from. She stepped closer, her bare feet silent, her warmth brushing the air as she stopped just inches away. The violet light caught her red skin, making it glow brighter, her presence a quiet force he couldn't escape. It's not just in you, she said, her voice softening, her breath a faint whisper against his jaw. It's here. She pressed a hand to her chest, then let it rest there, a simple gesture that carried weight. A thread ties us, your fall my watch. Do you feel it, Jace, where your thoughts linger, or deeper, where you're still alive? His throat tightened, her words sparking something he couldn't dismiss, his gaze holding hers as a warmth spread through him. Yeah, he admitted, voice rough, unguarded. I feel it everywhere. It's like you're reaching me already. What are you doing, Lyra? Showing me something I've missed, or pulling me into something I don't understand? She laughed, a soft sound that rippled through the air, her green eyes glinting with a mix of warmth and depth. I'm not pulling, she said, stepping closer still, her body near enough that he could sense her presence fully, her scent, wild, earthy, alive, filling the space between them. You're meeting me. Look at me, Jace, really look. Does my difference shake you? Or does it make you feel more than you expected? He swallowed hard, his chest tight, his hand lifting almost on instinct, hovering near her arm, but pausing. It's not shaking me, he said, voice low, steady despite the strange pull climbing within him. It's alive. You're standing there like nothing I've known, and it's waking something up. Where I come from, we push this down, feeling, wanting. You don't. Tell me. Do you want me to reach out? Or are you just seeing how far I'll go? Her gaze softened, her hand brushing his sleeve, a light touch that sent a shiver through him. I don't play games, she said, her fingers resting on his arm, firm but gentle. I ask, reach for me, Jace, if you want to. Are you afraid of what you'll find, or afraid it'll change you? His breath hitched, her touch warm through the fabric, his resolve wavering as he lifted his hand, letting it settle on her arm. Her skin was smooth, vibrant under his fingers, and he slid them down, slow and careful, tracing from her elbow to her wrist, feeling the life beneath. I'm not afraid, he said, voice a low rumble, his grip steady as he stepped closer, their presence meeting in the space between. But you're something else, Lyra. What happens if I do this? Does it bring us closer, or just show me how much I've been hiding? She leaned in, her lips parting slightly, her breath soft against his cheek as her hand slid to his chest, resting over his heart. It brings us closer, she whispered, her voice carrying a quiet strength. Feel me, Jace, here. She guided his hand, slow and sure, sliding it down her side, past her ribs, resting on the curve of her hip, a place of warmth and connection. He paused, his palm pressed there, her life pulsing faintly beneath his touch, and his mind steadied, every sense sharpened. Lyra, he rasped, voice rough, his fingers still as they rested on her hip, a steady warmth flowing through him. He pulled back slightly, chest rising, eyes searching hers. Did you want that? Me feeling you like this? Her breath steadied, her green eyes bright with something open, honest. Yes, she said, her voice low, clear, her hand resting lightly on his wrist. I wanted you to know me, where I'm real, where I stand. Tell me, Jace, does reaching me here trouble you, or does it make you want to stay? He stared at her, the air humming between them, her touch on his wrist a quiet anchor. It's both, he said, voice raw true, his hand still warm from her skin. You're too real, too much. I've never felt this pull, like you're already part of me. What does that mean, Lyra? Are we tied now, or just stepping into something bigger? Her lips curved, a soft smile easing the tension, her fingers tracing up his arm, lingering as she pressed closer, her presence steady against him. "It means we're here," she said, her voice a whisper that settled deep within him. Tied, stepping forward both. "So ask yourself, human, do you pull back because it's new, or because you're afraid it's already yours?" The planet's hum surged, a deep vibration shaking the ground, and Jace felt it, a shift, a ripple in the air. The spires flared brighter, their violet lights stretching shadows, and a new sound pierced the stillness. A roar, distant but closing, the sharp pulse of Ashari ships cutting through the sky. His hand tightened on her arm, instinct flaring as he drew her closer, shielding her without hesitation. "What's that?" he demanded, voice firm, eyes scanning the horizon as dark shapes descended, sleek and threatening, their purpose unmistakable. "My people," Lyra said, her voice sharp now, her body tensing against his. "They found us, they know. Are you ready to stand for this, Jace? For me? Or will you let them pull us apart before we've begun?" He turned to her, jaw set, resolve burning in his chest as the ships drew near. "I don't let go," he said, meeting her gaze, his hand still warm from her touch. "Whatever this is, they don't get to break it. So what's it going to be? Lyra, stand with me, or let them choose." The shadows loomed, the hum of the ships drowning out the planet's song, and Jace braced himself, a human bound to an alien, ready to fight for a connection he'd only just begun to feel. The Ashari ships descended like vultures, their sleek hulls slicing through the violet sky, their engines a guttural roar that drowned out the planet's hum. Jace stood rooted, his hand still gripping Lyra's arm. Her question, "Are you ready to fight for this, Jace, for me?" burning in his ears as the shadows loomed closer. The crystal spires flared, their light pulsing in frantic bursts, casting her red skin in a glow that made her look both fierce and fragile. Her green eyes met his, sharp with urgency, her white hair whipping in the wind, kicked up by the approaching craft. He'd felt her heat, that space between her thighs under his fingers, and now the thought of losing her twisted something deep in his gut, a soldier's instinct clashing with a man's need. "No one's taking you," he growled, voice hard, pulling her behind him as he drew his plasma knife, its blade flaring to life with a hiss. "You hear me, Lyra? Whatever this thread is, they don't get to cut it." Her hand tightened on his arm, her breath quick against his neck as she pressed closer, her body a warm shield against the chaos. "They'll kill you, Jace," she said, her voice low, trembling with a fear she couldn't hide. "They're my blood, my duty. They won't stop. Are you sure I'm worth this? Worth your life?" He turned, meeting her gaze, his jaw tight, as the first ship touched down, its ramp hissing open. "You're worth more than they'll ever know," he said, voice rough with truth, his free hand brushing her cheek, lingering there. "I felt you right here." His fingers slid down, tracing the curve of her jaw, then lower, hovering near her chest before stopping, the memory of her thighs still searing his palm. "Tell me, do you think I'd walk away after that?" Her eyes softened, a tear slipping free, but before she could answer, the Ashari emerged, tall, red-skinned like her, but colder, their eyes glowing with a predatory chill, their armor glinting under the spire's light. They moved with purpose, weapons humming, a dozen of them fanning out, their leader barking orders in a guttural tongue. Jay stepped forward, knife raised, his stance wide, every muscle coiled for a fight he knew he couldn't win. Not alone, not like this. The air crackled with tension, the planets hum a faint echo beneath the threat. "Stay back," he snapped, his voice a warning as the leader advanced, its gaze flicking between him and Lyra. "She's not yours anymore." Lyra's voice cut through, sharp and fast, speaking their language, her tone pleading but firm. She stepped beside him, her hand still on his arm, her words a desperate bridge he couldn't cross. "They want me back," she said, switching to his tongue, her voice low, urgent. "I defied them. Coming to you, binding to you. They'll end you for it, Jace. Do you understand what we've done, what I've cost you?" He glared at her, Then, at the Ashari, his grip on the knife tightening. "I don't care what it costs," he said, his voice a growl. "You're not theirs, you're mine. You said we're tied. Does that mean nothing to them, or to you?" "It means everything," she whispered, her hand sliding to his chest, pressing there, her fingers trembling. "But they'll tear us apart. Look at me, Jace. Do you think I'd leave you if I had a choice?" The leader barked again, its weapon flaring, a bolt of violet energy slashing the ground near Jace's feet, scorching the crystal dust. He didn't flinch, stepping closer to Lyra, shielding her as he raised his knife, defiance burning in his chest. "No choice," he said, voice low, fierce. "Then we fight. Together. Tell me, do you trust me enough to stand here, or are you already gone?" Her breath hitched, her green eyes wide with a mix of love and dread, her hand pressing harder against him. "I trust you," she said, her voice breaking, "but I can't watch you die. Not for me. Not yet." She stepped forward, her body brushing his, her lips grazing his ear as she whispered, "Run, Jace, live. Find me later. Can you do that? Let me go to save us." "No," he snarled, grabbing her wrist, pulling her back, his eyes blazing as the Ashari closed in. "I don't run. Not from this. Not from you. You're worth it. Every damn second. Tell me, do you feel me like I feel you? Or am I fighting alone?" She stared at him, tears streaming now, her hand clutching his, her voice a ragged whisper. "I feel you," she said, her fingers sliding down his arm, brushing his hand, guiding it to her side, pressing it there. "Here, where you touched me, where I'm alive. Do you think I'd forget that? Forget you?" The Ashari lunged, their leader's weapon flaring again, and Jace moved, fast, slashing his knife upward, the blade sparking off an invisible shield. The force threw him back, his shoulder slamming into a spire, pain lancing through him as he stumbled. Lyra shouted his name, her voice a desperate cry, and he lunged again, dodging a second blast, his knife carving a shallow arc through the air. But there were too many shadows converging, their weapons trained on him, their intent clear. He couldn't win. Not like this. "Jace, stop!" Lyra yelled, stepping between him and the leader, her arms raised, her voice cracking with panic. "They'll kill you. I have to go. For you. Do you hear me? Can you let me save you this time?" He froze, chest heaving, blood dripping from his knuckles as he stared at her, the knife trembling in his grip. "Save me," he rasped, voice breaking, his eyes locked on hers. "You're tearing me apart, Lyra. I felt you, right there between your thighs under my hands. How do I let that go? How do I let you go?" Her sob broke free, raw and sharp, her hand reaching for him, brushing his face as the Ashari closed in. "You don't," she said, her voice a whisper, her fingers warm against his skin. "You find me. Promise me, Jace. Promise you'll come for me, no matter what." "I promise," he said, voice rough, fierce, his hand catching hers, holding it tight as the Ashari seized her. Their grips were iron, pulling her back, her white hair whipping as she struggled, her eyes locked on his, pleading, loving, breaking. He lunged, a roar tearing from his throat, but a blast caught him square in the chest, throwing him down, his vision swimming as pain exploded through him. The knife clattered from his hand, the world tilting as he hit the ground, dirt and crystal dust stinging his eyes. "Lyra!" he shouted, his voice hoarse, clawing at the soil as they dragged her toward the ship, her red skin a fading streak against the dark hull. She twisted, her voice cutting through the chaos, faint but clear. "I'll wait, Jace, I'll wait." The ramp hissed shut, the ship lifting off, its engines a deafening roar that shook the spires, leaving him alone in the wreckage of their moment. He pounded the ground, fists bleeding, his chest tight with a void she'd left behind, a void where her touch still lingered, where her heat had burned into him. The promise echoed in his skull, a vow he'd bleed to keep, but the pain was unbearable, a soldier broken not by war, but by a woman he'd barely begun to hold. The spires dimmed, their light fading as the ships vanished into the sky, and Jace lay there, breath ragged, eyes burning with tears he wouldn't let fall. She was gone, and he was alive, alive with a hunger, a rage, a love he couldn't bury. He pushed himself up, staggering to his feet, the knife glinting in the dust as he retrieved it, its hum a faint echo of her voice. "I'll find you," he whispered, voice low, a vow to the stars, to her. "No matter what it takes, every damn drop. Do you hear me, Lyra? Are you counting on me like I'm counting on you?" The silence answered, heavy and cruel, but he didn't falter. Humanity didn't break. Not him, not now. She was out there, waiting, and he'd tear this world apart to bring her back. The crystal spires stood silent now, their violet glow dimmed to a faint flicker, as if echoing the void Lyra had left behind. Jace staggered through the wreckage of their last stand, his plasma knife clutched in a blood-streaked hand, its hum a weak pulse against the stillness. The Ashari ships were gone, their roar a fading memory, but her voice, "I'll wait, Jace, I'll wait," cut through him sharper than the pain in his chest, with a blast had thrown him down. He'd promised her, sworn he'd find her, and that vow burned in him, a fire he couldn't extinguish even as his body ached, his ribs bruised, his breath ragged with dust and despair. She'd slipped from his grasp, her red skin a streak vanishing into the dark, and the emptiness gnawed at him. A soldier broken not by war, but by a woman who'd marked him with her presence. He sank to his knees, the crystal dust stinging his cuts, his fists clenching as her memory filled him. Her warmth, her strength, alive under his touch, a moment that had steadied him, lingered, a pull he couldn't let go. He'd felt her, where she'd stood with him, where she'd trusted him, and now she was gone, leaving him with a resolve he couldn't bury. "Lyra," he rasped, voice low, raw, his head dropping as he struck the ground once, twice, the sting anchoring him. "You're counting on me. I know it. Tell me, do you feel me out there like I feel you?" The planet didn't answer, its hum a distant echo, but he pushed himself up, jaw tight, eyes burning with a determination forged in loss. His ship was a ruin, his crew dead, his comms silent, but he wasn't finished. Not while she lived, not while that thread she'd spoken of still bound them. He stumbled forward, the spires casting long shadows across the fractured ground, every step a battle against the ache in his bones, the weight of her absence pressing on his soul. The forest gave way to cracked plains under a blood-red sky, the air thick with a metallic tang, and he walked. Hours, days, time blurring as hunger clawed at his gut. Thirst parched his throat, but her face kept him moving. On the seventh day, he saw smoke, a thin plume rising from a jagged ridge, a sign of life in this alien wasteland. He crept closer, his knife ready, instincts sharpening as voices reached him, rough and human. A camp sprawled in the shadow of the ridge, tents patched with scraps, figures moving with purpose, their weapons glinting under the crimson sun. Rebels, outcasts, survivors like him, their faces scarred, their eyes hard but alive. A woman stepped forward, gray hair tied back, her stance steady, a rifle slung over her shoulder. "You're a mess," she said, her voice gravelly, eyeing his torn jacket, the blood caked on his hands. "Name's Zara. What's a half-dead man like you doing out here?" "Jace Carter," he said, voice firm despite the exhaustion, his gaze meeting hers. "They took her, Lyra. I'm getting her back. You in, but do I keep moving?" Zara's brow lifted, her lips twitching with a smirk, but her eyes narrowed, weighing him. "Ashari? You've got nerve, I'll give you that. What's she to you? Some alien worth bleeding for." He stepped closer, his voice dropping, fierce and unwavering. "She's more than that. She's everything. I felt her. Right here," he said, pressing a hand to his chest, the memory of her presence steadying him, vivid and strong. "They drag her away, and I swore I'd find her. Tell me, Zara, ever lose someone so deep it tears at you? Or am I the only one still fighting?" She studied him, her smirk fading, a flicker of understanding in her gaze. "Yeah," she said, voice softening, tossing him a canteen. "Lost mine years back. Ashari took them. We've got a raid planned, a stronghold, their prison hub. If she's there, we'll break it. But you're a wreck. Train with us, or you'll die before you see her. Can you push through that pain? Or does she just weigh you down? He caught the canteen, the cool metal steadying him as he took a long drink, water spilling down his chin, washing away the dust. I push because of her, he said, wiping his mouth, his voice a quiet rumble. She's out there, waiting, counting on me. Do you think she knows I'd tear this planet apart for her? Every step? Zara clapped his shoulder, her grip solid, a rare grin breaking through. She'd better. Rest up, Carter. We move in 3 days. You'll need more than a knife for this. The camp buzzed around him, rebels sharpening blades, checking rifles, their voices a rough chorus of defiance. But Jace barely heard them. He sat by a fire that night, the flames flickering in the dark, his eyes tracing the light as her face rose before him. Her red skin, her white hair, the way she'd stood with him. It wasn't just memory, it was strength, a tether pulling him through every moment of this ordeal. He'd trained with the rebels, his body tested to its limits, sparring until his hands ached, running drills until his lungs burned, learning their tech, their ways. But it was her that kept him alive, her voice in his mind, her promise resonating in the stillness. Zara found him later, her shadow falling over him as she crouched by the fire. You're good, she said, her voice low, appraising. Fast, strong, better than most. But you're distracted. What's holding you, Carter? Her memory, or what you left behind? He stared into the flames, his hand tightening on the knife at his hip, the memory of her warmth a steady ache he couldn't release. Both, he said, voice rough, honest. I felt her, right here where she reached me. She's not just a memory. She's a fire I can't lose. Tell me, Zara, does it ever stop cutting, or do I just carry it? She sighed, her gaze distant, the firelight carving lines into her weathered face. It doesn't stop, she said, her voice quiet, heavy. You carry it, use it. She's your strength, Carter. Don't let it slip. Can you turn that ache into something they'll pay for? Yeah, he said, nodding, his jaw tight as he met her eyes. They'll pay for taking her. I'll make sure of it. Do you think she's holding on out there, waiting like she said? Zara stood, her hand resting on his shoulder a moment longer. If she's half as determined as you, she is. Get some sleep. We're hitting them hard. He lay back on the hard ground, the fire's warmth a faint shadow of hers, his mind racing as the camp quieted. He saw her, her green eyes pleading as they dragged her away, her voice breaking with "I'll wait," and it tore at him, a wound he couldn't heal. He'd felt her, stood with her, promised her, and now she was a prisoner, a star he couldn't touch. The rebels gave him a chance, a plan, 3 days to train, to sharpen, to turn his pain into purpose, but it couldn't fill the emptiness. He closed his eyes, her presence a whisper in his mind, her strength a memory he held fast, and murmured into the dark. I'm coming, Lyra. Hold on. Do you feel me out there like I feel you every step? The crimson sky loomed above, the planet's hum a faint pulse, and Jace steeled himself, a man driven by loss, by love, by a vow he'd bleed to keep. The raid was coming, and he'd tear their world apart to bring her back. The crimson sky hung heavy over the Ashari stronghold, a fortress of black stone and glowing conduits carved into a jagged canyon, its walls pulsing with a cold, alien light. Jace crouched behind a ridge, his scavenged rifle steady in his hands. The rebels fanned out like shadows in the pre-dawn gloom. 3 days of training had sharpened him. His muscles ached from drills, his knuckles scarred from sparring, his mind honed by Zara's relentless lessons. But it was Lyra that drove him, her face alight in the dark. Her voice, "I'll wait, Jace," rang in his mind, her presence a memory that fueled every restless moment. He'd promised her, sworn he'd find her, and now the time had come, a vow he'd bleed to fulfill. Zara's voice crackled in his earpiece, low and sharp. Hit hard, Carter. Get in, get her, get out. We've got your back. Her team moved with precision. Charges set, rifles primed, a ragged band of human defiance against an alien empire. Jace nodded, his jaw tight, his pulse steady as he gripped the detonator she'd entrusted to him. The stronghold loomed, its gates sealed, its sentries patrolling with glowing eyes. But he saw only her, trapped within, waiting, relying on him. "Go!" Zara barked, and the ridge erupted. Explosions ripping through the outer wall, stone shattering in a plume of dust and fire. Rebels surged forward, their shouts raw, human, slicing through the alien hum as they stormed the breach. Jace moved with them, his rifle barking, shots precise. 2 sentries fell, their bodies crumpling in streaks of red. He broke away, weaving through the chaos, past crumbling turrets, through corridors of sharp stone and flickering conduits, his boots pounding the floor as his heart beat her name. Every shadow was a threat, every hum a warning, but he pressed on, a soldier driven by a purpose no war had ever given him. A sealed chamber loomed ahead, its door a slab of black metal pulsing with energy, a faint hum seeping through. He slammed the rifles but into the control panel, sparks flying as it shorted out, the door grinding open with a hiss. There she was, Lyra, her red skin dulled by captivity, her white hair tangled and matted, trapped in a cage of shimmering light. Her green eyes widened, her breath catching as she turned, her hands gripping the bars, her voice a broken whisper. "Jace? You came?" "Always," he said, voice rough, dropping the rifle to rush to her, his hands finding hers through the bars, her warmth anchoring him like a lifeline. "Did you think I'd break that promise, after everything?" Tears streaked her face, her fingers clutching his, her voice trembling as she pressed closer. "I thought they'd broken us," she said, her sob raw, unguarded. "They locked me here, drained me, questioned me, but I felt you, Jace. Here." She pulled his hand through the bars, pressing it to her chest, a steady gesture that carried her strength. "Did you carry me with you? Every step? Or was I just a hope you couldn't hold?" "You're no hope," he said, smashing the cage's controls with his fist, the light flickering out as the bars collapsed. He pulled her free, her body crashing into his, and he held her, tight, fierce, her presence fitting against him like a piece he'd lost. "I felt you. Every day. Right here, where you reached me. Tell me, Lyra, did you hold on because of me, or because you had no choice?" "For you," she whispered, her lips brushing his ear, her breath soft and shaky as she clung to him, her hands gripping his jacket. "I fought them, every moment, because I knew you'd come. Can you feel it? How much I needed you right here." She pressed his hand to her chest again, a quiet move that steadied his pulse, her strength a fire he'd chased through hell. An alarm screamed, boots thundering closer, shattering the moment. Zara burst in, her rifle blazing, rebels firing behind her as Ashari guards stormed the chamber. "Carter, move now!" she shouted, tossing him the detonator. Jace armed it, the stronghold shuddering as the core began to overload, a deep rumble shaking the walls. He grabbed Lyra's hand, pulling her through the chaos, past collapsing conduits, through smoke and fire, dodging blasts as the rebels covered their retreat. An Ashari lunged, its weapon flaring, and Jace shoved Lyra aside, taking the hit. A graze to his shoulder, pain searing through him as he stumbled. "Keep going," he growled, pushing her forward, his arm bleeding but his grip firm. They broke through a crumbling wall, the canyon opening before them, the stronghold's core erupting behind, a deafening roar, a plume of dust and flame swallowing the fortress. Rebels scattered, their cheers raw against the dawn, but Jace and Lyra ran, her hand in his, her breath ragged as they reached the ridge, the sun breaking over the horizon in streaks of gold and red. They stopped, breathless, her fingers laced with his, her body trembling against him as she turned, her green eyes wide with relief and something deeper. "We're free," she said, her voice soft, breaking, a tear slipping free as she pressed closer. "You did it, Jace, you found me. But at what cost? Did we lose too much to get here?" He pulled her into him, his arms tight around her, her warmth a balm to the ache he'd carried, his shoulder throbbing but forgotten in her embrace. "Not you," he said, voice low, fierce, his hand resting on her back, holding her close. "We lost time, blood, pieces of me, but not us. I felt you, every night, right here, driving me forward. Tell me, Lyra, do you regret it, loving me through all this?" "Never," she whispered, burying her face in his chest, her tears soaking through his jacket, her hands clutching him like she'd never let go. "I'd do it again, every pain, every chain, just to be here now. Can you forgive me for leaving, for making you fight alone?" He tilted her chin up, his eyes locked on hers, his voice rough with a love he couldn't hide. "There's nothing to forgive," he said, his thumb brushing her cheek, wiping away a tear. "You saved me, gave me something to fight for. Do you know what you are to me? Everything, Lyra, every single thing." She smiled, fragile but real, her lips trembling as she leaned up, her breath warm against his. "And you to me," she said, her voice a whisper, her hand resting on his chest, steady there. "But look at us, scarred, bleeding, alive. Did we win, Jace, or did we just survive?" He glanced back, the stronghold a smoldering ruin, rebels limping away, their voices a faint echo of victory. Then he looked at her, her red skin glowing in the dawn, her white hair tangled, her green eyes alive with him. And he knew. "We won," he said, voice steady, pulling her closer, his hand resting on her shoulder, a quiet anchor. "But it cost us everything we had left. Tell me, do you think it's enough, this dawn? Or do we keep fighting for more?" She pressed her forehead to his, her breath mingling with his, her voice soft but sure. "It's enough," she said, her fingers threading through his. "For now, this moment, you and me. Can you live with that? Us, scarred but together." "Yeah," he said, his voice breaking, holding her tight as the sun rose higher, painting them in gold and red. The rebels' cries faded, the planets hum a distant song. But for Jace, it was her, the price they'd paid, the scars they bore, that made this real. A love won through blood, a dawn bought with pain, a bond no force could break.